Before we begin, this episode discusses Operation Red Christmas, a military offensive that happened in December 1981. The episode includes references to violence, including sexual violence against civilians. For the most graphic material, I'm going to refer you to our primary source documents back on Substack, rather than describing them in great detail here, which may risk this video getting taken down. These subjects are important historical matters. They also contain very disturbing content. The documentation, including the testimony from the survivors, can be found on Substack, and the link to those is all below. December 17th, 1981. 3 crises, 3 continents, 1 system being tested in real time. In Rome, Italy, U.S. Brigadier General James Dozier is locked in a cage. Red Brigade terrorists have kidnapped him this morning. At the White House, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North is working all the phones. He's calling Italian police, he's calling the Pentagon, the CIA, but he's also calling Texas billionaire H. Ross Perot. He's asking Perot if he will help him by personally wiring $500,000 into an Italian bank account for a private ransom attempt. In Nicaragua, something brutal is unfolding. The Suriname Contra forces are 3 days into what they're calling Operation Red Christmas. They've killed 7 Sandinista soldiers in the village of San Carlos. In 11 days, they'll capture a Miskito doctor named Myrna Cunningham. What they'll do to her, what they'll tell her while they're doing it, will expose the direct connection between the CIA's training camp and the atrocities going on the ground. The goal isn't just terror, it's territory. Grab enough land to declare a new government and then trigger direct U.S. military action. And in Paramaribo, Suriname, men with cameras are photographing Fort Zeelandia. They're mapping the routes from the airport to the capital. They're checking out communication towers and power stations and government buildings. When the locals ask them what they're doing, they just smile and they point to the binoculars. We're birdwatchers, they say, studying tropical species. But they're not birdwatchers. They're scouts from the Joint Special Operations Command, the JSOC, their military unit specifically created to handle terrorist threats. December 17, 1981 is the day when the Reagan administration's crisis response system went live across 3 continents all at once. They were testing a new type of warfare, and Suriname was up next. This is the Suriname Contra Affair, Part 4, Operation Red Christmas. My name is Matthew Smith, and I grew up in Suriname, just next door to the dictator that this story is about. In our previous 3 episodes, we showed you how Reagan's administration built a shadow government with the new crisis management structures, the legal power to wage secret wars without asking Congress. By December of 1981, that system was ready to go live. 3 weeks earlier, at the 14th Annual Conference of the American Armies at the Watergate Hotel in the United States, U.S. military intelligence officials got everybody to agree on something very important. Soviet-aligned revolutionary movements would no longer be called revolutionary governments. They would be labeled terrorists. This wasn't just playing word games, this changed everything, because revolutionary governments require diplomacy. Congress has to know about them, international law applies, but terrorist threats, different rules kick in. Crisis response operations, fast action, fewer questions. The Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, had been created specifically to handle terrorist incidents after the failed Iran hostage rescue attempt during the Carter administration. But here's the trick. When you label a revolutionary government as a terrorist group, suddenly JSOC can get involved. The counterterrorism teams can deploy. And in December 1981, those teams were being sent across the Caribbean basin. But to truly understand what was being planned in Suriname, you have to understand what they were testing out in Nicaragua. Because Operation Red Christmas wasn't just a military track. It was a blueprint. It was a test run for a new kind of warfare. For 43 years, Nicaragua had been ruled by the Somoza family, one of Latin America's most brutal dictatorships. The Somozas owned a quarter of all of Nicaragua's arable farmland. They controlled airlines and shipping and cement factory and banks, When an earthquake hit the country and destroyed the capital city of Managua in 1972, Somoza's National Guard looted the city while international aid money disappeared into the family's bank account. The National Guard wasn't a professional army per se. They were Somoza's family's private militia. They stayed in power through torture and terror and making people disappear and murders. In July of 1979, the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional marched into Managua. They built a broad group of supporters, students, workers, business leaders, Catholic priests. They practiced a new type of Christianity, or an emerging type called liberation theology. Even parts of the National Guard started to switch sides. After months of urban warfare that killed almost 50,000 people, they won. Against insurmountable odds, a popular revolutionary movement had overthrown a US-backed dictatorship. And that terrified the Reagan administration, because Nicaragua wasn't alone. It was part of a pattern. Remember, we talked about how Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia in 1975, and then Angola in 75, Ethiopia in 79, Iran in 79, Grenada in 79, followed by the Suriname Sergeant's coup in 1980 of February. From Washington's point of view, the dominoes were falling. Nicaragua was the latest domino, and it was only 1,200 miles from the Texas border. By 1981, Reagan and his team had decided that Nicaragua would not be allowed to succeed. The Sandinistas were accepting Cuban advisors, they were building relationships with the Soviet Union, they were supporting leftist movements in El Salvador and Guatemala. To the Reagan administration, they looked exactly like Cuba, being copied all over again. So the CIA began building the Contras, which was short for Contra-Revolución, the counter-revolution. The core of the Contra movement were the former National Guard soldiers, so Somoza's henchmen, his thugs, now being recycled and rebranded as freedom fighters against communism. But there was a problem, which was nobody liked these guys. They had no popular support. Everybody reminded them that they were Somoza's men. And that's where the Miskito people came in. So the Miskito are an indigenous group living along Nicaragua's Atlantic coast, a region that had always been culturally separate from the rest of Nicaragua. For centuries, they kept their own language, they had their own way of governance, they had a relationship with the land. And when the Sandinistas took power in 1979, they had big plans for that Atlantic coast. They wanted to bring it into the revolution. They wanted to adopt literacy campaigns in Spanish and development programs and land reform. But the Miskitos saw this as another type of cultural invasion. Here you had Spanish-speaking people from the Pacific telling them how to live and trying to replace their language and customs with revolutionary talk. The Miskitos wanted autonomy, self-rule, recognition of their indigenous rights. They were real grievances that they had. By February of 1981, tensions exploded. The Sandinistas arrested leaders of the Misurasata, the Miskito indigenous organization, including a charismatic young leader called Stedman Fagoth. So after his release, Fagoth went into exile in Honduras, and that is where the CIA found him. The agency saw an opportunity. The Miskito had real complaints against the Sandinistas. They could claim indigenous rights. They could make the Sandinistas look like colonizers, just another modern version of Spanish conquistadors. So the CIA helped Stedman Fagoth create Misura, which was a new Miskito indigenous military group that was aligned with the larger Contra movement. So they provided Misura with training camps in Honduras, with weapons, with advisors, and with money. So this was the same strategy that the CIA had used during Laos in the Vietnam War. Recruit ethnic minorities with real complaints, use them as proxy forces, then step up U.S. direct military involvement when the proxies had established themselves a base. So many of the CIA officers who were running the Nicaragua operation had been veterans of Laos campaign. So they knew the playbook, they'd seen it work before. And in 1981, November, they gave the green light for something that was called Operation Red Christmas. The plan was ambitious. Misura forces would launch a major attack along the Atlantic coast. They would seize territory, they would get enough land, hopefully, to declare a provisional government. And then the United States would provide open military support, turning the covert war into a regular one. So direct American action would support this indigenous government, fighting against the Sandinistas' colonialism. What they were planning for Nicaragua in December of 1981 was a blueprint, a test of how you could manufacture the justification for U.S. military action using these indigenous proxy forces and propaganda. But what happened next was brutal. On December 20th, 1981, Missouri fighters captured 7 Sandinista soldiers in the village of San Carlos. And what they did to those men, the torture, the mutilation, was designed to send a message. When the villagers found the bodies, they understood this wasn't just war. This was terror. The full details about what were done are documented in the sources listed in the show notes. I'm giving you the basic facts here, but you really should take the time to read the complete record for yourself. 8 days later, December 28th, Missouri forces captured Dr. Myrna Cunningham and her colleague Regina Lewis. Dr. Cunningham was a Miskito doctor, one of the few from her community who had earned a college degree. She was heading to a remote clinic to practice and provide health care to her people. What happened next and what those men did to Dr. Cunningham and Regina Lewis over the next few hours, and what they told them while they were doing it, is documented in Dr. Cunningham's own testimony. I'm not going to describe it here. Even if I read those words out loud, this would get this video removed from YouTube, but you need to read it to see what she said. Because over the years, Dr. Cunningham testified about exactly what her attackers told her during those hours, how they bragged about having American training in camps deep in Honduras, how they showed her American cigarettes and American food and rations as proof of their backing, how they chanted Christian slogans, Christ yesterday, Christ today, Christ tomorrow, while assaulting her. They wanted her to know, we have American support. We can do whatever we want. And they told her they were going to kill her and leave her body as an example of other people who work with the Nicaraguan government. Her testimony is in Holly Sklar's Washington War on Nicaragua, pages 102 to 103, and it's linked in the show notes on Substack. It's difficult to read, but it's necessary to understand Operation Red Christmas, what it actually was, and what was being done in the name of freedom and Christianity. Now, that 2-month attack failed to grab enough territory for a provisional government, but it did accomplish something else. It provoked a harsh response from the Sandinista government. And in January 1982, the Sandinista government forcibly relocated 8,500 Miskito and Sumo people away from the Rio Coco war zone. They forced 42 northern border communities to evacuate, making people walk 60 kilometers into resettlement camps in the interior called Sabapri. These relocations were brutal. About 12,000 Miskito fled to Honduras rather than go. The International Commission of Human Rights would later find evidence of arrests and prisoners held without anyone knowing they were there, torture, disappearance, hundreds of Miskito. And the Reagan administration seized upon this opportunity, upon this crisis, as they say, let no good crisis go to waste, and they grabbed it and used it as propaganda gold. So Secretary of State Alexander Haig, he went on television, he accused the Sandinistas of committing genocide against the Miskito people. UN Ambassador Jean Kirkpatrick showed photographs at the United Nations, images of bodies and mass graves and violence against indigenous people. But there was one problem. The photographs weren't from 1982. They were from 1978. A French magazine that showed a massacre committed by the Somoza dictatorship that the Sandinistas had overthrown. The Reagan administration had manufactured a genocide accusation using fake evidence. But it worked. Miskito leaders who had originally supported the Sandinistas, like Teofilo Archibald, whose fingernails were pulled out during detention, he now toured the United States begging for support. Quote, without U.S. help, we will not survive. We will all be dead. American newspapers ran with the story about Sandinista atrocities. Congress heard testimony from indigenous people, and the story shifted. The Contras weren't right-wing terrorists. They were freedom fighters, protecting indigenous people from communist oppression. So here's how the operation works. Step 1, you launch brutal proxy attacks designed to provoke government response. Step 2, when the government responds, harshly document it. Step 3, exploit that response with propaganda, manufacturing justification for action. And finally, step 4, use the manufactured crisis to build support for open military action. This propaganda campaign would continue for years. By 1986, more than 10,000 additional Miskito would flee to Honduras. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights would investigate and confirm serious allegations by Sandinista government, forced location, harsh treatments, and disappearances. I'm not trying to paint this as a black and white thing where it was one good side and one bad side. This is a very complicated political matter, but the abuses were real. The suffering was real. The indigenous people were caught between two empires, neither of them seeming to care about their freedom. But the crisis had been deliberately provoked, then systematically exploited. Operation Red Christmas wasn't just a code name, it was a method. And within months, that same Red Christmas would surface again in a place most Americans wouldn't be able to find on a map. But first, they had to prove that the method worked. All right, December 17th, 1981. That same day, Operation Red Christmas was unfolding in Nicaragua. In Verona, Italy, U.S. Army Brigadier General James Dozier, the highest-ranking American NATO officer in Italy, is kidnapped by Red Brigade terrorists. Now, the Red Brigade are a far-left Italian terrorist organization. They've been kidnapping and killing officials for years. In 1979, they kidnapped former Prime Minister Aldo Moro and they killed him after 55 days. Now, they have an American general. At the White House, the Dozier kidnapping becomes Oliver North's responsibility. North is 38 years old, a decorated Marine veteran who'd served in Vietnam. He'd been assigned to the National Security Council, and he's been there since August of '81. And he's already become a go-to guy for these sensitive clandestine operations. He works with the Italian police, with the Pentagon, with the intelligence community, but he's also doing something else, something that won't appear on official State Department cables or Pentagon memos. He's calling H. Ross Perot. Now, for those of you who do not know, Henry Ross Perot was a Texas billionaire who'd made his fortune in data processing. But more importantly, he's a man who believes in direct action. In 1969, Perot agreed to work behind the scenes for the Nixon administration. He was trying to improve the treatment of American prisoners of war in Vietnam. For 12 years, he'd been the guy that you go to when the government needed something done quietly, something that couldn't be done through official channels. In 1979, when the Iranian Revolution trapped two of Perot's employees in Tehran, he didn't wait for the State Department. He hired a team of commandos who staged a private rescue mission, and it worked. Now, Oliver North knows this story. Everybody in covert operations world knows this story. So when Dozier gets kidnapped, North reaches out to Perot with a question. Would you be willing to fund a private ransom? Now, according to Ben Bradley's carefully researched work, Guts and Glory, The Rise and Fall of Oliver North, Perot agreed. And in January of 1982, he wired $500,000 to an Italian bank account in exchange for a ransom. But here's what's crucial. Perot believed he was acting with government consent and authorization. Years later, when asked if North was working with higher authority, Perot said, "My sense is always that people who do these kind of things in the government are getting very meticulous approval for their activities. Maybe by the time I started dealing with Colonel North, specifically, I had been pretty well programmed in that direction because that had always been the case." So he thought North had approval, at least that's what he was saying, and he thought that this was just U.S. official policy, executed through private channels. But while Perot was wiring the money to Italy, President Reagan was making his position on terrorism very clear. On January 27, 1982, the day before Dozier was rescued, Reagan told reporters, "America will never make concessions to terrorists. To do so would only invite more terrorism." It was a statement that he would repeat over and over again at press conferences and speeches and addresses to the nation. We will not negotiate with terrorists. We will not pay ransom. We will not make deals. But Oliver North, working under the crisis management authorities that Vice President Bush had constructed, was doing exactly that. With private money, with wealthy patriots who believed that they were serving their country. The public policy was one thing, the shadow government's actual operations were something entirely different. But while North was building his private funding network, something else was happening. A massive crisis response operation that most people don't know about. The Pentagon sent Colonel Jesse Johnson, leading a 6-man Delta Force and intelligence support activity personnel, to Italy. The intelligence support activity, otherwise known as the ISA, had been created just months earlier, specifically to solve the intelligence failures that had doomed the Iran hostage rescue operation during the Carter administration. So these were signal intelligence specialists who could track counterterrorism in real time. So ISA operators equipped a Bell helicopter with radio scanning equipment and electronic tracking gear. Every time the Red Brigades communicated by radio, the ISA could lock on to their signal to figure out where they were. Now, this was cutting-edge technology in 1981. The ISA had ground units and vehicle networks. When they found a frequency, they would pass it on to the NSA, the National Security Agency, who would then use spy satellites to pinpoint where the safe houses were. One safe house after another got mapped, one Red Brigade member after another was arrested, and on January 28, 1982, Italian police found Dozier's location in Padua and staged a dramatic rescue. 10 members of Italy's elite crisis response unit raided the apartment. They found Dozier in a tent. They knocked out 3 of the armed guards immediately. There was a 4th who was holding Dozier with a gun to his head, but before he could kill the general, they were able to subdue the man and rescue Dozier without incident. So they captured 5 Red Brigade members in total. They avoided any casualty without firing a shot. And Dozier was freed, and the money was returned to H. Ross Perot. But something more important had happened. Oliver North had just established the blueprint. When official U.S. policy won't allow something, just find a private citizen who will fund it. And this is happening in January of '82, more than 4 years before the Iran-Contra scandal becomes public, more than 2 years before Oliver North starts building what would become known as the Enterprise, a network of private donors and arms dealers and offshore bank accounts that will fund the Contras after Congress cuts off their support. But the blueprint is already there. And North would use it again and again. Find the wealthy patriots, convince them they're serving their country, use their money to do things that Congress won't authorize. Over the next 3 years, North went back to Perot repeatedly. For Beirut hostages, for Lebanon operations, arranging millions in secret funding. In March of 1984, when CIA Beirut Station Chief William Buckley was kidnapped, North asked Perot for $2 million. Perot immediately agreed to make the money available whenever needed. Now, the ransom attempt failed and 15 months of torture followed, where Buckley died in captivity. And that is where the arms for hostages deal with Iran began. And there's something else that's significant. North later told people that Perot made him a promise. According to North's own memoir, Perot said, quote, "If he goes to jail, I'll take care of his family." And think about that. You got to remember, Perot was actually also a presidential candidate. If it wasn't for him running as a third-party candidate, George H.W. Bush, the former CIA director, may have won a second term. But because Perot came in and siphoned off 19% of the vote, Bill Clinton ended up becoming president instead. So it's that same man who's running covert operations with George Bush and Oliver North during the Reagan administration. And this is how the shadow government really worked. It wasn't just legal powers and organizational charts. It was personal relationships, wealthy patriots who believed that the ends justified the means, and these private funding networks and cutouts that could operate when the official channels couldn't. The Dozier kidnapping proved the concept for the private funding, but it also proved something else. JSOC and ISA could execute successful crisis responses. The intelligence support activity's signal intelligence had been decisive, Delta Force planning had been flawless, and Operation Winter Harvest, which was the code name for the Dozier rescue, was ISA's first major success. Okay, now we get to the part that you've all been waiting for. According to Sean Naylor's book, Relentless Strike, which is the secret history of the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC reconnaissance teams conducted covert surveys of Suriname from late 1981 into 1983. These were not random intelligence officers. They were the same elite crisis response units that had proven their capability in Italy. They were JSOC's covert operators, and let me tell you who they were. So you start with Det 1 MACOS. Now that stands for Detachment 1 Mission Airlift Command Operations Staff. It was an Air Force Special Operations unit. Their official role was air traffic control for special operations. Their real role was secret reconnaissance. In late 1981 and early 1982, Det 1 MACOS operatives infiltrated Suriname undercover. According to a JSOC official quoted by Naylor, they went down to Suriname and surveyed all the airfields under the guise that they were birdwatchers. The official added, quote, "We had lots of guys go down there. It's easy to get people in and out." Now imagine the scene for a second. Paramaribo, hot and humid. Locals see these American men sweating in their khaki vests and they're pointing to their $1,000 binoculars, not at the canopy, but at the crumbling walls of a 17th century Fort Zeelandia. They're meticulously noting guard rotations in a notebook, meant for tracking macaw sightings. The birdwatcher cover was as brilliant as it is absurd, because Suriname is an ecological paradise. It's home to 700 different bird species. Many could be found nowhere else on Earth. One of my favorite memories as a child is walking to school every day on these dirt roads flanked by drainage ditches and watching these red scarlet macaws that would perch on the fence post as we would go back and kind of talking to the birds, right? And there was myriad birds just like that I'd never seen before in my life. So these operators arrived with their cameras and binoculars and field glasses, and they wore their khakis and lots of pockets on them and carried notebooks that were supposedly recording their bird sightings, but the cameras weren't just for the birds. They were photographing Zandere International Airport, its runway lengths, its terminals, its layouts, its fuel storage facilities, everything you're going to need to know if you were planning on seizing it in a combat assault. They were mapping the route from Zandere down to downtown Paramaribo, which I believe, if I'm remembering right, is around 54 kilometers, through a jungle, past small villages, over bridges, the exact route a rescue force would need to know. But here's what's critical. It wasn't preparation for a typical type of invasion. JSOC was not the 82nd Airborne Division. They weren't designed for conventional warfare or nation building. JSOC was created specifically for terrorist incidents. So hostage rescues, raids on terrorist compounds, surgical strikes against high-value targets. And after the 14th Conference of the American Armies had relabeled Suriname Revolutionary Government a terrorist organization, Bouterse's regime wasn't just a concerning left-wing government anymore. It was a terrorist organization that could be targeted using crisis response powers. Now, these are the Reagan administration's terms for this government, not mine. By relabeling Bouterse's regime, they had activated JSOC's counterterrorism authorities. And according to Sean Naylor's reporting, JSOC wasn't just gathering intelligence for a potential backup plan. They were developing a full-scale operation. And you should read this book yourself. I'll have a link to this and scan through that. So Delta Force would conduct the initial strike. They would hit multiple targets at once. According to a Pentagon official who was quoted by Naylor, we would have to go into several different locations and bring the expats, the Americans, to the airfield. At the same time, we'd got to take over the radio and the TV stations and grab the president. And that president is Henk Chinesen. Now, hostage rescues coming from multiple locations, you're seizing the media, your regime removal, all at once. This is a classic crisis response mission planning, not an invasion, not an occupation, surgical strikes against specific targets. So the Army Rangers would seize the airfield at Zandere. Task Force 160, the Army's Special Operations Aviation Unit, the Night Stalkers, would provide helicopter support. And then the heavy forces would arrive, the 82nd Airborne Division and the 101st Airborne Division. By early 1982, we're talking January, February, March here, the JSOC Tactical Command Post and representatives from all units in the operation had moved their training to Hurlburt, Florida for a 6-week exercise to plan the operation. Now, 6 weeks, that's not just weekend drill here. This is a full mission profile rehearsal. According to one account, they simulated a carrier-launched assault. That means helicopters deploying from an aircraft in the Caribbean, flying to Suriname, and conducting the operation. So they assigned specific roles down to each unit. Delta Force teams knew their target. Ranger Company knew which airfield to seize. Air Force Special Ops crews knew the flight plans. Everything was planned, everything was rehearsed, and everything was ready. The JSOC senior official quoted in the book was quoted to have recalled, "I thought we were going to war." The same units that had rescued General Dozier in Italy were preparing to conduct a crisis response operation in Suriname. The blueprint was proven, the capabilities were demonstrated, the plan was rehearsed, everything was ready, and all they needed was a trigger event. But the Birdwatchers were only the beginning. Now, Eric Haney was a founding member of the Delta Force. In his memoir, Inside the Delta Force, he describes something that happened in 1982. Quote, "We spent the better part of a year planning for the invasion of a small tropical country that had managed to get itself on the U.S. government's shit list. I won't name the country." Okay, so he won't name the country, but he describes it, a small tropical nation, an American corporation facing taxation. So that American corporation was most likely Alcoa Aluminum, which was facing some threats of nationalization or heavy taxation by the Bouterza regime in 1981. So he says CIA-backed guerrillas who stopped the tax, an invasion plan that sat on the shelf unused. But then he writes, quote, "But we had a custom-tailored invasion plan sitting on the shelf, an expensive one, and it seemed a shame to let that go to waste." Haney describes the planned force, Delta Force, the 1st Ranger Battalion, a Marine amphibious unit, Navy and Air Force support. He says the final rehearsal cost alone was over $1 billion in 1982 money. $1 billion rehearsal for an invasion that never happened. That matches exactly what we know from Sean Naylor's book about Suriname. 6 weeks of rehearsals at Hurlburt Field in mid-1982, all the pieces in place, the plan is ready to execute, but no trigger, no incident to justify intervention. So the plan sat on the shelf. Now, according to a Miami Herald article in 1987, Oliver North controlled an integrated 250-person special operations package. Now think about what that meant. It meant the ISA for signal intelligence, political security operations, SEAL Team 6 for maritime and hostage rescue, Delta Force for surgical strikes and assault operation, Task Force 160's helicopter pilots for aerial support, Rangers for rapid airfield seizure, and heavy follow-on forces from the 82nd and the 101st Airborne on standby. All coordinated by one Marine Lieutenant Colonel at the National Security Council. This wasn't a contingency plan, this was capability. It was a versatile 250-person regime change toolkit that could deploy anywhere in the Caribbean basin on a 48-hour notice. October 25th, 1983, 14 months after the Suriname rehearsals, the United States invaded Grenada. Haney was there. He describes flying into intense fire in a Black Hawk helicopter, part of a force that included Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, Task Force 160, Rangers seizing the airfield, and the 82nd Airborne providing heavy support. The Miami Herald later confirmed, in October 1983 invasion of Grenada, Oliver North assigned ISA units to protect Sir Paul Schoon, the island's governor, to ensure that Schoon could assume political leadership once the United States had overthrown the leftist government. That's the Suriname plan. Simultaneous strikes, secure the political leadership, seize the airport, deploy heavy forces, and frame it as a rescue operation. They designed it for Suriname, they rehearsed it at Hurlburt Field, they refined it through the Reconnaissance mission, and when Suriname didn't provide the trigger, they executed the same plan in Grenada. So think about what this means. The Reagan administration had developed rapid deployment capabilities specifically designed to overthrow small Caribbean and Central American governments in 48 hours. It had dedicated special ops units totaling 250 personnel, helicopter assault forces with night flying capabilities, intelligence units that could provide undercover in target countries, political warfare specialists who could secure leadership transitions, heavy follow-on forces to consolidate control, a command structure that bypassed the Pentagon and the CIA and Congress after having been told no that summer, and it was seemingly all coordinated by a young Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North at the National Security Council. And we know that he coordinated with the Grenada operation. Suriname was the development lab, the place where they mapped the targets, rehearsed the operation, and refined the techniques. Grenada was the proof of concept, the successful execution that validated the capability. Nicaragua became the ongoing application for covert operations, helicopter assaults, political warfare, all using the same units and the same methods. 250 people, one coordinator, multiple countries, one blueprint. The Birdwatchers in Suriname were not just gathering intelligence. They were a reconnaissance team for a standing regime change force that the White House could deploy at will. And that force was ready, rehearsed, and waiting. And all they were looking for was an incident that would justify using it. Now, Haney's memoir ends his Grenada chapter in this way. America, quote, declared a great victory and felt good about herself again. But he never names the country where they rehearsed that victory first. The small tropical nation where they'd spent a year planning. The place where the custom-tailored invasion plans developed. And this is important because if he had said that, then we would have a first-hand account of one of the forces that was on the ground during this operation, which would make this a lot firmer of a case. But 4 years later, in 2006, Haney was interviewed by Maxim magazine, and this time he named it. He said, quote, "We had actually been training to invade Suriname, but a CIA coup succeeded there, and we used the same plan on Grenada." There it is. From a founding member of Delta Force in his own words. They trained to invade Suriname. They rehearsed the operation, they had the plan ready, but, quote, after a CIA coup succeeded there, after the December murders, after the destabilization, after the political warfare operations, they didn't need to invade anymore. So they took that same plan, the one they'd spend a year developing, the one that they rehearsed at Hurlburt Field and for 6 weeks, the billion-dollar invasion plan, and they used it in Grenada instead. Same unit, same structure, same operational concept, just a different island in this case. But Haney's quote reveals something else that's important. He says, after a CIA coup succeeded there. A CIA coup. Haney says it like it's all a known fact. Everyone understands what he's referring to, but it's not widely known. Most people have never heard of this story. So what's he talking about? What happened in Suriname that made a full-scale JSOC invasion unnecessary? What event changed the calculation so dramatically that they took their billion-dollar blueprint and used it somewhere else? And that is the story of the December murders. Now, we'll get back to that. We're going to work our way to the December murders. But in January 1982, we still have a lot more story to tell. Because just weeks after the December 17th convergence, just days after the Dozier rescue proved the private funding model, 2 American operatives arrived at the U.S. Embassy in Paramaribo. And they weren't coming to do diplomacy. They were coming to find Surinamese that were willing to fight. Remember NSDD 17, we need indigenous forces. We need to make this look like a local operation. And what these men set in motion would end with 15 men executed in a fortress courtyard, an entire country traumatized, and a blueprint proven. Now, let me show you how we know all this, okay? Just as a recap, because this operation is still classified and the files are sealed. I've got multiple Freedom of Information Act requests in the process, but that can take years, and the government still won't release all these operational details, so we have to find another way. So we need to find the operational signature of the person who was involved. Think of it like a lock where you have multiple tumblers and you got to get them all to line up for things to open. Each piece of the evidence is the tumbler that needs to click into place. And when they all align, we'll have the locks open. Okay, so here's what we have. Tumbler number 1, the blueprint. That's Sean Naylor's book. It shows us the operational plan, what JSOC was planning on doing, the reconnaissance teams, the rehearsal at Hurlburt Field, the structure, all of that. It tells us what was planned, but not who planned it or whether it actually happened. Tumbler number 2, you've got Eric Haney's 2006 Maxim interview. We'd actually been training to invade Suriname, but after the CIA coup succeeded, we used the same plan at Grenada. That's a Delta Force founding member confirming that the Suriname operation was real. They trained for it. A CIA coup happened there. The same plan was reused in Grenada. It tells us what happened, but not who coordinated it. Tumbler 3, the Grenada connection. Declassified documents from the Grenada operation show that Oliver North was running point. The crisis pre-planning group, the operational coordination, Constantine Menges, North were working together with others. And it tells us who ended up with the blueprints in their hand from Suriname when they executed it in Grenada. But we still need to link that back to Suriname itself. So that is when we get to the tumbler number 4, the master key. So the Miami Herald article from July 1987, which was published after the Iran-Contra scandal broke, written by investigative reporters who interviewed dozens of participants. It lays it out, blow by blow. Oliver North controlled every single unit that Sean Naylor describes in his book. He, quote, the capabilities North oversaw included the intelligence support activity, a new Navy commando unit called SEAL Team 6, a helicopter assault force, Task 160, about 250 people assigned to the units. The article states that in 1983, North grabbed the job of coordinating all these forces. But here's what's important. Just because he took over in 1983 doesn't mean that he wasn't involved in 1981 and 1982. All those working groups, like the crisis pre-planning groups, weren't formed yet. Some of them were. But the command structures, they were still loose. But the Miami Herald makes it clear, quote, when you needed to get something done, he was willing to do something. He made himself the de facto guru of counterterrorism and the special operations business in Central America. That's the master key. That's the person who controlled all the units. ISA, Delta, SEALs, Task Force 160. It was Oliver North. And then tumbler number 5 is the eyewitness, and that is Ambassador Robert Duemling. In his oral history, and by the way, he would not get into Suriname until the fall of 1982, and we'll cover him in later episodes. But this is what he said, quote, we had Delta teams surreptitiously introduced into the country to make assessments and take pictures, like the Birdwatchers, and gather intelligence. I knew about this because I had them in the embassy, ostensibly to assist us with some contingency plan. Duemling goes on to describe briefing of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the summer of 1983, right before Grenada, whether the U.S. should invade Suriname. He told them it would take about 200 paratroopers to seize the capital and military compound. That matches exactly what Naylor and Haney described. It confirms Delta teams were actually in Suriname. So I'll show you here the side-by-side comparison. So this is the Suriname plan. You've got ISA Reconnaissance Team, the Birdwatchers, Delta Force for Operations, SEAL Team 6, Task Force 160 for helicopter support, Rangers, the 101st and 82nd Airborne, rehearsals, etc. You look at the Grenada execution, same ISA units, according to the Miami Herald, Delta Force that Haney describes, SEAL Team 6, Task Force 60, Boom, boom, boom. Now, ISA in Grenada is protecting Governor Schoon. ISA in Paramaribo, down in Suriname, would have been protecting Henk Chinacen. Every tumbler clicks into place, the blueprint. It's real, it's trained for. The same person coordinated it. The person was Oliver North, it appears. Delta teams were actually in Suriname. The same plan was executed in Grenada. That's not circumstantial evidence, that's a documented operational signature. The person who coordinated the Suriname operation, who sent the ISA Birdwatchers to survey the country, who rehearsed the 250-person special operations package at Hurlburt Field, who then took that same blueprint and executed it successfully in Grenada, that person appears to have been Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, operating under the crisis management authorities that Vice President Bush had constructed, bypassing the Pentagon, bypassing the CIA, directly answering to the National Security Council. It all ran through one office, one man, a Marine Lieutenant Colonel at the NSC who had become the White House's secret Minister of War. So now we have a good idea who was running the shadow war in Suriname. The question is, what were they trying to trigger? January 4th, 1982, just 2 weeks after Operation Red Christmas had begun, and just a week after Oliver North secured Ross Perot's funding commitment for the ransom over in Italy, President Reagan made it official, signing NSDD-17. It was titled Cuba and America. It authorized the CIA to provide money, weapons, training, and support to democratic fighters fighting communism across Central America and the Caribbean Basin. Proxy warfare was officially now known as crisis response. Under NSDD-3 and 17, the United States could deploy covert military forces under the banner of counterterrorism, if a terrorist or a humanitarian emergency justified it. The problem is, crises rarely show up on schedule. And when they don't, they have to be manufactured. Operation Red Christmas was the prototype. You exploit ethnic divisions, you exploit state retaliation, you document the violence, and then you invoke the rescue mission. That's what made it legal. That's what made it deniable. And in Nicaragua, the CIA had found their indigenous forces. It was the Miskito that were backed by Stedman Fagoth. His mission was to seize the territory, hold the ground, and wait for the cavalry, just like the crisis response units that we talked about stationed at Hurlburt Field in Florida. That was the model that NSDD had authorized. Local surrogates on the ground, American command in the shadows. But Suriname didn't have their Stedman Fagoth. They didn't have any face of the democratic resistance to wave the flag and the democratic rescue banner. There was no atrocities that had happened yet, no humanitarian relief that was needed, nothing to activate the emergency powers. The teams were ready, the reconnaissance was done, the legal authorities were signed, but they didn't have that trigger that they needed. And there was one more problem, which was men like Ambassador John Crowley Jr., a Carter-era diplomat. Carter had designated every ambassador on Earth as his own human rights representative in that country. What Reagan had planned would not fall under the category of human rights. Crowley might report covert operations like this to Congress. He would have to be removed first. December 10th, 1981, 7 days before Desi Bouterse stood in front of the Monument of the Revolution and launched the Revolutionary Front, Ambassador John Crowley was terminated from his post. Officially, just a routine rotation of personnel. In reality, clear the field. One less witness before the JSOC operatives are deployed. December 17th, you had the convergence of all the events. In Nicaragua, Red Christmas occurred. In Italy, General Dozier was kidnapped and Oliver North mobilized his private rescue network. And in Paramaribo, Bouterse's new front aligned Suriname with the Cubans and the Sandinistas. The signal was unmistakable, but it wasn't the trigger yet. There was no hostage crisis and no massacre, no pretext for the invasion. But within weeks, new American operatives would arrive. Not birdwatchers this time, but wolves. Political warfare specialists, men who had done this before, in Chile, in Grenada, in Indonesia, all over. Men who would find the Surinamese and create the resistance that were willing to fight, that could bring a plan that would allow the cavalry to be called off of standby. Because the Reagan administration had just proven something in Nicaragua. When you exploit indigenous movements for geopolitical purposes, when you provoke violence to manufacture the justification that you need, when you promise support but you deliver abandonment, people die. And they die in ways that we document for historical record, not because we want to shock you, but because we need to understand what was actually done. What was done to people like Dr. Cunningham, what was done to those 7 soldiers, some of whom buried alive in San Carlos. What would soon be done to 15 men in a colonial fortress in the capital city of Suriname. All of it needs to be documented, all of it in sources, all of it was done in the name of freedom. And in Suriname, a lot of people were about to die. Thanks again for joining us on this week's episode of the Suriname Contra Affair. As always, I know some of this is tough material to listen to, but I think we're making some really good progress here. I also wanted to thank those of you who've recently joined and subscribed both here and on Substack. We've added another 500 members or 500 subscribers in the last week, which is a lot of fun for me to see the growth of this channel. So continue to share this for us. Go ahead and like and subscribe if you haven't already. That way you'll get notifications when new episodes drop. Go ahead and subscribe back on Substack so you can read the original research material, get links to the original newspaper articles and other types of research videos, things like that we put in the transcript notes for each episode. Additionally, if you know anybody who was part of the missions that were down in Suriname in 1981, 82, 83, members of these ISA or Delta Force or other units that would be willing to talk and share their experience, that would be invaluable in understanding parts that we may have missed that might need some clarifications, or any other people that were involved with this, whether it's politicians or funding sources, both on the American side of the house and down in Suriname as well, or other countries, because this was a large web down in Latin America and the Caribbean Basin. So until then, go ahead and like and subscribe. You see all the links here, and we will catch you next week with another exciting episode of the Suriname Contra Affair. Thanks for your support.